feel like I'm being upstaged by a mouse and Jane Austen this time. Sorry guys. Goodbye. Hi everyone, it's Jenny and welcome back to my channel. I'm here today to do a mid-month wrap-up after my mammoth one last month. I'm doing what I promised for once in my life. So the first book that I read was an audiobook, which I don't have a physical copy of, so apologies for no pictures yet. I'm still working that out. But it was The Watchmaker of Filigree Street by Natasha Pulley. I first heard about this on Katie from Books and Things channel because it was in her favourite books of 2018. In fact, I think it was her favourite book of 2018. So it came highly recommended and it was really fun. I did enjoy it, not quite as much as her. It was a 4-star read, not a 5-star read for me. But it's set in 1880s London, so obviously that's already ticking boxes for me, set in the Victorian period. And it's about a character called Nathaniel who works in the civil service and has quite a mundane existence and isn't particularly affluent through his work, and how one day he goes home and he finds a pocket watch mysteriously on his pillow that he doesn't know the origin of. And he manages to track down the watchmaker who turns out to be Japanese, and it kind of goes on from there. There's a little bit of magical realism, but it's not heavy on that. So if you're not a fan of magical realism but you like historical fiction, don't be put off by that. It's really, really fun and definitely a quite original look at Victorian society, because while it's really good at examining the etiquette that was so embedded within that world, it also looks at Japanese people. And while Victorians really loved Japanese art and culture, it's not something that is explored in literature ever, really. So that was just great fun to read. And I feel like it hasn't really had much press or acclaim, and it definitely deserves more. I hope that some of you will go and read this book. Then I read a Women's Prize shortlist book, which I put down in April because I was prioritising other books, but I finished in May, and that is Ordinary People by Diana Evans. This follows two couples, Michael and Melissa, and Damien and Stephanie, and how their relationships, or their marriages more specifically, are under pressure and whether or not they'll reach a breaking point. It's set in London and it's incredibly specific about the geography where each of the characters live and work and travel, and I really enjoyed that. I thought her attention to detail was excellent. If you don't enjoy detailed, character-driven writing, this is not for you. I think some people could find this boring, and I can see how that criticism holds up in some ways. I liked it. It was definitely a 4-star read, but there are some kind of slightly supernatural elements that really come to a head towards the end of the book, and I didn't like that as much. Not to give anything away particularly, but there are elements of it throughout the book that are peppered through it, and I just didn't like the end as much as I liked the beginning. I guess I liked the very, very end. I liked the last line, which is a really important thing to me. If I don't like the ending, I just hate the book overall. It just spoils the whole reading experience for me. But I can see why some people wouldn't like this, but also how some people love this. I think the writing is excellent, the characterization is excellent. I really like how she writes about modern life, especially urban modern life. But I don't know if I would want this to win over other shortlisted books. But I'll talk about that when I do my shortlist video. Sorry, that was a really rambling way of saying I liked this. It's well written, but character driven. There's not much plot. Also, if you are going through a rough patch in any of your relationships, don't read this book, because it's quite depressing in that way. Then I got back to Victorian literature and I read The Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy. This was his 6th published of what happens to appropriately be the 6th one I have read by him as well myself. I really like this one, but I have to say out of the 6 I've read, this is my least favourite. But don't let that discourage you. This is still a 4-star book, just all the other 5 for me have been 5-star reads. I part listened to this in an audiobook, which is narrated by Alan Rickman, which gave me all kinds of feelings, let me tell you. I feel like the plot is quite a lot more complicated than Hardy's normal narratives, because there isn't just one couple that it focuses on. There's a kind of love square / pentagon going on in this book. But to start at the beginning, Clym Yearbright is the native who is returning to Egdon Heath, I think it's called, which is this expansive, wild place in the country. And obviously Hardy always writes landscapes and pastoral descriptions really well, so there's a lot of that in here, and that is completely wonderful. That's one of the best aspects of this book, I would say. Clym is cousin to Tamsin, or Tamsin, it's spelled a funny way, who is meant to marry Damon Wildeve, I think, and he has put off the marriage because he's in love with Eustacia, I think that's how you say it, and she puts off him and then wants to marry Clym because she sees him as a way out of her situation, because she's thought of as kind of like a mysterious witch-like woman. She's got a bit of a dodgy history in some ways, and Clem is this man who she thinks can whisk her away, but then a distance grows between it, and there's just lots of complicated backwards and forwards of who should have been with who and who actually goes with who, and then there's a lovely character called Diggory Vem who is in love with Tamsin and just wants to make her happy. It's quite hard to explain beyond that, but you can see the pentagon that is there now. It's brilliant. It reminded me how much I love Thomas Hardy, and I really need to read more of him. I think I'm going to read one in October, maybe two in a tower. I'm quite drawn to that one. I like tragedy, so Hardy and me get along well. Then I read a book that I've been meaning to read since I was a teenager, and it's just been on my shelves for probably about a decade, and that is The Double Life of Cassia Roadknife by Jenny Valentine. I read her other books when I was a teenager, and I loved them, but I'm really getting too old now, I just want to give this away, so I just read it to get off my shelves really. But I did enjoy it a lot more than I expected to. It's about a boy who takes the identity of a boy called Cassio Roadknight who has gone missing to try and find acceptance because he is lonely and without a family, and he just wants a normal life. And it's partly about how, if he can keep that lie up, but also there's a mystery kind of thriller plot, I suppose, where he, with the help of one of Cassio's friends, is discovering what really happened to get to Cassio Roadknight, and it's quite clever. I mean, for a children's book, obviously it's more basic than adult plots, but it was actually quite impressive, and obviously I could guess more, I think, than if I read it 10 years ago. But it was definitely a fun read considering I'm 25 now, and this was still pretty good. Obviously just a really quick read as well, so it was nice. Then I read Girl with the Pearl Earring by Tracy Chevalier. Who knows, you can't even see, the name is there, you can't really see it. But this was a book that I got for my birthday last year, and I'm really glad to have read it within a year. It was just so well written and really brought that period alive. It's set in the 17th century, I think. Is it? Wait, let me check. Yes. 17th century Holland, and it's about, and from the perspective of the girl who was the subject for the famous Vermeer painting Girl with the Pearl Earring, and it begins when her family have fallen on hard financial times and she has to be sent out to be a maid in the household of Vermeer, and how her relationship with him grows from cleaning his studio to becoming his painting subject, and I suppose in some ways muse. There were some really historical facts in here, like how they would keep valuable paint in pigs' bladders. I mean, that is nasty, but it was interesting to learn about those things and what colours and what things made the colours of the paints. I feel like it's very simply written. I don't mean that in a bad way, I just mean that it's not written with flourish. It doesn't feel like she's trying to impress anyone. She just writes really effortlessly, and it's so readable. If you don't read historical fiction very often, I would highly recommend this one. It's also just interesting reading about the difference in religion and art as well, and people's opinions on art and what was decent and what wasn't. Then I finally got around to reading The Fishermen by Chigozie Abioma, yes. And this is a book that was shortlisted for Man Book in 2015, so that's quite a while ago now. And this follows 4 brothers in western Nigeria who obviously are fishermen, and they disobey their father and his instructions to not fish in a certain river that he says is forbidden and out of bounds. And they encounter a madman there who gives a prophecy that the eldest brother will be killed by one of the other 3. And it's really about how that affects their brotherly bond and how it breaks it, and whether or not it comes true, and just the repercussions of that prophecy essentially, and the ties of family and mysticism and tradition and religion. It was really beautifully written in a way that was just so rhythmical and almost quite poetic, I would say. It was completely different to what I normally read, and I definitely am interested in picking up this other book now. Then I read a book that was such a fun read, and that is The Trouble with Goats and Sheep by Joanna Cannon. Everyone was reading these things about Elsie recently, and I definitely want to get to that soon. I might even try to get to that this month, but this was such a good time. It's set in the heatwave in England in 1976, and it's got 2 children at the heart of it, Grace and Tilly, who are trying to discover what's happened to their neighbour Mrs. Creasy, who has gone missing. and there's a whole interviews with the police. It's partly from their perspective and partly third person perspective, and it's how this disappearance unleashes all these secrets and worries with other neighbours. Also, most chapters begin with a certain house number, so at the beginning, I'll just show you, it has a lovely diagram with which characters live where in the avenue, in the street where Grace and Tilly live. You see? I hope so. And it's really clever way of moving through the narrative, because sometimes Grace and Tilly aren't narrating the story and it switches to third person, so then you know which characters you're dealing with, and it was quite fun to refer back to that little key at the beginning to see who we were following at that point in the book. It was quite funny. I think it was really endearing and a really gentle read, because it's about children really, and because of that there's just a lot of humour and opportunity for really clever satire. There's a lot about them trying to find Jesus and things like that won't make sense to you now, but go and read it and find out why, because it's so clever and I loved it. I don't normally read mystery. This is not the kind of thing I read. I'm not really into crime, but this is so unthreatening that it's exactly the kind of book I like to read when I just want something light. It was a really good holiday read, I would say, and definitely a summer read, that kind of book you can just sit and not have to think too much. But it is actually quite a page turner though, I would say. I'm looking forward to reading her second novel now. Then I read a tiny book, and that is Mr. Salary by Sally Rooney. Anything Sally Rooney writes now I want to read, and this is part of the Favourite Short Stories collections to celebrate their 90th year. This follows Suki, who due to difficult parental circumstances I suppose moved in with Nathan, and it's not a sugar daddy relationship in the sense that they're not partaking in a sexual relationship, but he is financially supporting her and she is significantly younger than he is, and it's really about years after they have been living together and her coming back to him and trying to break off the arrangement, if you want to call it that. It was just really well written as always. I wanted more, wished it was slightly longer, but I think for a short story it was incredibly well crafted. There's not much to say about it because it is so short, but I've definitely like to read more in the series, but if anyone's read any in the Favourite Short Stories collection apart from this one, then I'd like to hear about that. Then I read a book which was highly anticipated on Booktube, and that is Jane Campbell's wonderful poetry collection, The Girl Aquarium. Anyone who knows Jen's writings and interests, especially reading taste, will know that she often deals with fairy tales but through a very dark lens, but also about disability and deformity. And one of my favourite poems in here is Hallow Dark, which deals with blindness, or the impending threat of blindness, and how it's perceived and how information is given about it in the world and on the internet, and I really thought that was a beautiful poem. Also, there's lots of northern poems in here because I think she lived in Newcastle or near there, and I have family from there, so I loved how it was written because it's very Geordie style and there's a lot of dialect. I think if you can't hear the accent in your head you might find that difficult, but I thought that was a wonderful way of adding an extra texture to the poem. And another poem actually of mine, another favourite poem of mine, even, I did not write this, was Angel of the North, and I thought that is another real stand-up poem. I think out of all the poems about the north of England, that was my favourite from the collection. But I feel like everyone knows they should read this. It's Jane Campbell's poetry. You should go and read it. Go and support her. She's wonderful. Then I read The Last Tudor by Philippa Gregory, which is the last in her Tudor series, but I think it's fine reading them as standalones. I haven't read any of them before and I didn't feel like I suffered for having read this one first. Though I have to say I'm not sure if I want to read more, because I would sum this book up by saying, oh, a bit harsh mate, to some of the Tudors in control. It follows the three Grey sisters and it begins with Jane and then moves on to Catherine and then to Mary, so it's nice that they each get quite an equal section of the book, and I definitely think I warmed to each of the sisters more as it went through the book. I liked Mary the most because it starts with Jane and then moves to Catherine and then to Mary, and I think she's probably the most relatable character because she's kind of in between her other two sisters. Jane's very, very pious, and then Catherine is completely opposite and is very worldly and just wants to have a nice materialistic romantic life, and obviously a lot of things are denied these sisters. But it was really fun to read something like this because I just haven't read Tudor history for a while. I do feel like I need to have a break though, and it definitely changed my perspective on Elizabeth, I'll say that. Some of the things that happen in this book are quite surprising to me, and I just knew nothing about them. So it was good to read. I feel like I learned a lot about Tudor history because everyone just saw things about Elizabeth first and then stops. You forget Jane Grey was even queen a lot of the time because it was just for 9 days. So yeah, I think I would recommend it. But yeah, it's quite harsh. Not in a graphic way. Not there's a graphic torture scene or anything, but yeah, Elizabeth. God. Then we have a whole batch of women's prose books, and so the first one is shortlisted, and that is An American Marriage by Tayari Jones. This is possibly my favourite out of the 5 I've read so far, I want to say. It's quite similar to Ordinary People in the sense that it's about a couple who are struggling with their marriage, but it's also completely different in so many ways. I mean, for one, it's set in America and not London. But it follows Celestial and Roy, who are a couple that are trying to rekindle their romance when Roy is wrongly accused of rape and is imprisoned for 5 years. And part of the narrative is before, obviously, and then it goes to their letters when they're in prison, and I really loved that part. I'm such a sucker for epistolary novels or just things about letters, as you know. I really like letters in books. I think they just work very well. I think because letters are very intimate, so you will be more likely to be honest and reveal things about yourself in a way that you wouldn't in a conversation necessarily, especially because there's a lot of thought put into letters. So I loved that part, and maybe that's why I like this more than Ordinary People. And then it's also about obviously when Roy comes out of prison and whether or not he can rekindle his love with Celestial. I found this book very moving, especially when there's the conversation between Celestial and Roy whether or not they can try again after he comes out of prison. It really makes you think, what would you do in that situation? It's so easy to try and say you do the honourable thing, but there's a lot of questions about loyalty, and is it more important to be loyal to your husband or loyal to yourself, especially when you're in limbo and your husband's been put away for a long time. Also the way that she writes about racism in America and how it's so easy to be wrongly convicted of crimes like this is pretty heartbreaking and just really affecting. I do feel like that out of the 5 that I've read so far, this is the one that I would recommend the most readily to people. Then I read a book that was longlisted for the Women's Prize, and that is Swan Song by Kelly Greenberg Jeffcott. And this is a book that I heard about and didn't know if I would love, like I said, because it's a lot about Truman Capote and how he was great friends with a lot of high socialite women, but he betrayed all their secrets by writing about them in Esquire magazine. And it goes backwards and forwards in time. It begins right as he's about out to publish it and him negotiating with different newspaper editors how much money he'll get and who he'll publish in. It also moves before he wrote these damning exposés of his friends, or so-called friends, when he was actually on holiday with them, or it just talked about his relationship with them before he damaged it himself and sabotaged it to the point of no return, really. And it also obviously deals with the aftermath of his writings and how that affects the women and their husbands or just their lives in general. It was incredibly beautifully written. I know that it was effortless, but it took the author, I think, about 4 years to research and write, so huge admiration for her. I also think it was quite a nice book to be longlisted, and in a way it's kind of a shame it isn't shortlisted. I think the quality of the literature in here is incredible, and also it is about women really, turning their back on a man who just betrayed them. Also, I would highly recommend the audiobook because the woman who narrates Truman Capote is incredible and it added a lot to the narrative. Then last but not least, I have the 5th book that I've read from the shortlist, and that is The Science of the Girls by Pat Barker. This is about Briseis, or however you say that, who is a smaller character in the Iliad, and how she talks about Achilles in quite a negative way after he ransacks her city and takes her as his price of honour. It is really brutal. There's a lot of violence and rape, so trigger warnings for all of that. The thing about this book is I completely agree with everyone else's criticism that it's really well written, but there's too much about Achilles here. The beginning of the narrative was the most powerful for me in a way, because it's about the women's fear as they're cowering away from the battle when they know that Achilles is going to ransack their city and that they're just going to become slaves. and that for me was the most visceral part of the whole narrative, because it's part first person Brisis but part third person talking about Achilles, and Brisis is talking about Achilles even when it's her speaking a lot, and I think that's kind of a shame because I wanted to know more about the women and their fears and their daily struggles and lives, especially when she's making friends with other women of honour who are essentially the sex slaves of people like Agamemnon, you know, these great masculine warrior figures who are painted as just brutal pigs essentially. I really enjoyed that analysis of them, and I think it wasn't just one-sided, don't get me wrong, it's very complex and intricate characterisation of all these people and figures of ancient Greek myth, but it just wasn't about the women enough, and I think actually I haven't read Cersei yet, but I have higher hopes that that will focus just on the women more, because we don't need all this about Achilles. It was really well written, I can't fault that. This is the first book I've read by Pat Barker, and I will definitely read more by her soon. I've actually got another novel by her that I've had on my shelf for ages, so maybe I'll get to that soon, that would be super nice, but it wasn't what I wanted it to be. And I will say, this was still a 4-star read. All of the books I've read so far from the shortlist have been 4-star reads. But I don't think that this deserves to win the Woman's Prize because it was a missed opportunity, I think. There we go, hopefully that wasn't 35 minutes long like the last wrap-up video. So, yeah, you know the drill. If you have thoughts, if you have read these books, please tell me what you thought of them. If you know, don't like them, you can tell me now because I've read them, and that's okay. and if you don't like books I've read, then we can just agree to disagree, and that's okay too. But let me know what you've read so far. Knowing me, this will probably go up much later than I wanted to, but I've done it, and there will be another wrap up for May later, probably next month, let's be honest. But I'll see you soon for more bookish shenanigans. Bye!